My daughter-in-law Madison demanded $1,600 a month in rent from me for a single bedroom in my very own house so she could financially support her own mother, Stephanie. My son Tyler didn't say a word. So I just nodded, finished my coffee, and started packing that exact same morning. 3 days later, my quiet strike officially began. And it was only then that they realized who actually kept that historic Oak Park Craftsman house running safely. Have you ever felt like an invisible checking account to the very people you rescued? The kitchen smelled like lemon-scented chemical surface cleaner and deep, heavy betrayal. Madison had spent the entire morning scrubbing the granite counters as if a shiny veneer could somehow sanitize the rot of her entitlement. I didn't scream, and I certainly didn't beg my son Tyler for an explanation he was far too cowardly to provide. My 30 years of professional experience as a senior logistics and fleet operations coordinator instantly overrode my maternal heartbreak. In my world, when a critical supply chain fractures, you don't waste time weeping over the spilled cargo. You isolate the bottleneck, you reroute the shipment, and you execute a clean, decisive disinvestment. Anger wasn't loud this time, it was clinical. I tried to summon a wave of regret as I walked away, but there was only an icy, unyielding clarity. This wasn't an emotional breakdown, it was a cold balance sheet. I retreated to my first-floor master bedroom and turned the heavy brass deadbolt. The lock clicked into place with a sharp, satisfying precision. Inside, my laptop screen glowed with a different kind of sunrise, the kind made entirely of unyielding facts, numbers, and quiet retribution. My compassion had been an expensive luxury this couple had routinely overdrawn for years, and their corporate account with me was now officially frozen. They weren't shocked by the cruelty of what they'd done, they were shocked that I'd finally stopped playing along. My first strategic move took exactly 4 minutes. I logged directly into the master portal of our family living trust and permanently revoked Tyler and Madison's proxy access to my secondary financial reserves. For 2 long years, they had treated my personal savings like a permanent, interest-free line of credit to fund their ongoing lifestyle inflation. With a few definitive keystrokes, that pipeline completely evaporated. Next, I bypassed all local brokers to coordinate an unannounced extraction with an elite, long-haul corporate moving team. Finally, I pulled up the digital deed files for my privately held lakefront cedar bungalow in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. I opened the smart climate application on my cellular phone and preheated the entire property to a comfortable 72 degrees. My new operational headquarters was secure, uncompromised, and waiting. The passage of time over the next few days wasn't marked by a calendar, but by the systematic, total cessation of my domestic presence. I stopped making their morning meals. I left their expensive, automated espresso pod machine completely dark, letting them figure out its blinking error codes entirely on their own. I stopped clearing their plates from the sink, and I terminated the high-speed wireless internet routing to the second floor. If our relationship was to be strictly transactional, then every single asset under this roof would be tightly bound by true legal ownership. A tenant owes a landlord money, Madison, not unpaid structural labor. I looked around the historic Oak Park Craftsman mansion. Robert had poured the steel-reinforced concrete foundation with his own hands, but a house is nothing more than real estate without the functional engine that keeps it running safely. Madison truly thought she was running the entire show, simply because she organized the Daily Mail, completely oblivious to the fact that I was the one anchoring the entire financial overhead. The living soul of this home was about to be systematically packed away into plain, unmarked cardboard boxes, leaving them with nothing but an empty shell of brick and looming, catastrophic liabilities. The long corridors of this estate had completely changed. The grand hallway now smelled like burnt toast, old dust, and calculated silence. I found myself pausing directly before a dust-covered graduation photograph of my son Tyler, which sat on the dark mahogany console table. Looking into his youthful, completely innocent face, I felt a heavy, suffocating wave of introspection, tracing the deep historical roots of the financial parasitism I had so foolishly allowed to take root. 2 years ago, Tyler stood on the absolute edge of total professional ruin. He was drowning in catastrophic derivative trading debts that threatened not just his livelihood, but the immediate, permanent forfeiture of his stockbroker license. Like an endlessly sacrificing parent, I threw open my doors. I gave him and Madison the entire second floor rent-free, providing an emergency safety net to rescue them from complete public bankruptcy. For 24 consecutive months, I silently bankrolled their lives, covering the steep Cook County property taxes, the master homeowner's insurance premiums, and the municipal utility overhead out of my own retirement nest egg, while Tyler routinely claimed he needed his paychecks for volatile investments. I kept wondering, as I stared blankly at that frame, what did I ever do wrong? The truth is, my historical sacrifice was never an act of true love. It was a deeply ingrained maternal instinct that fatally mistook indulgence for protection. I had been caught in the invisible chain of the survivor, completely trapped in a psychological cage where I believed that if I stopped cushioning his falls, my only son would break completely. I honestly thought I was acting as his shield against a ruthless world. In reality, my endless enabling had created a monster of pure, unadulterated dependency, completely castrating his basic ability to function as an adult. A painful memory flashed vividly behind my eyes, cutting through the heavy quiet of the hallway. When Tyler was 16, he crashed his car into a neighbor's brick retaining wall after a night of reckless, unsupervised choices. He had come home trembling, weeping, begging me not to tell his father, terrified of the structural fallout. And back then, filled with a misplaced, protective devotion, I quietly stepped in and cleaned up the entire mess. I paid for the vehicle and property damages out of my own pocket and hid the truth from everyone. I told myself I was saving his future. But looking back now, with ice-cold clarity, I see that I wasn't saving him at all. I was simply teaching him that his worst choices had zero real-world consequences, and that his mother would always be there to stop the bleeding. My maternal safety net had become a permanent entitlement they took for granted without a second thought. But they had pushed their entitlement too far. This latest extortion scheme devised by Madison, met with Tyler's spineless, gutless neutrality, was the final catalyst. My silence was no longer an act of passive surrender. It was the absolute, quiet awakening of a sovereign mother who finally realized that her late husband, Robert's sacred legacy, the very bone structure of the house he carefully designed, was about to be completely cannibalized by the very people chose to rescue. Madison and Tyler fatally mistook my tactical retreat for an unconditional surrender. To a parasitic mind, quiet boundary setting looks exactly like absolute defeat. By Friday morning, Madison had left a stark printed domestic chore grid resting directly on the granite kitchen island. It was a cold, laminated checklist demanding that I execute the weekly grocery runs, manage the baseline housekeeping, and handle the heavy laundry for their entire household. She didn't leave a single dollar bill to cover it. They genuinely, completely expected a rent-paying tenant to simultaneously function as an uncompensated maid service. Later that afternoon, my screen lit up with a harsh notification. Madison had posted a public status update on Facebook for our entire extended social network and family to read. Some people live in luxury for free and completely forget who carries the actual burden of homeownership nowadays. I didn't type a furious reply. I didn't call her out in front of the family. I simply took a high-resolution screenshot, filed it away as material evidence under my strategic deployment folder, and went right back to calculating the logistics of my departure. Dinner that evening was an exercise in pure structural cowardice. Tyler completely refused to meet my gaze. My son, a grown man pushing 40, spent the entire meal staring blankly into his plate, hiding like a child behind his glass of water. He had completely gaslighted himself into believing that demanding $1,600 a month from his widowed mother was a fair, sophisticated restructuring of household equities. He had traded his entire spine just to avoid a domestic argument with his wife, convincing himself that my 30 years of invisible labor were just an automated debt I owed his household. The absolute peak of their unearned arrogance arrived right after we finished eating. Madison's phone rang, and she deliberately answered it on speakerphone right there at the kitchen table. It was her mother, Stephanie. Madison beamed, her voice vibrating with a malicious glee as she bragged about how she had fully neutralized the household finances. "The situation with Patricia is completely taken care of, Mum," Madison said, looking directly across the table at me with a patronizing smirk. That $1,600 is hitting our balance sheet on the 1st. Your luxury lifestyle and wellness coaching certification classes in Aspen are officially funded. Stephanie laughed loudly on the other end, a sharp, entitled sound that echoed through the home my late husband Robert had spent his life building. I sat there in total silence, letting my phone record the audio under the edge of the table. Calm, factual, lethal. As they left the kitchen, my eyes drifted to the expensive, automated espresso pod machine Madison had bought to replace my trusty old drip maker. It sat dark on the counter, its pristine digital screen flashing a blinding blue service error code. A thick, calcified buildup had entirely choked the internal filtration system. Neither of them possessed the functional capacity to run a structural diagnostic check, let alone execute basic manual maintenance. It was the ultimate architectural monument to their lifestyle, flashy, exorbitant, and completely useless, the exact moment it lacked the invisible labor required to keep it running safely. I immediately shifted my operation from passive boundary maintenance to a full-scale, systematic assault on the home's legal and physical infrastructure. The time for emotional compromise had completely expired. I scheduled a private afternoon meeting with my longtime asset and estate attorney Vanessa in her quiet, mahogany-lined office downtown. I needed a meticulous, uncompromised audit of our entire operational system. Madison believed that a single piece of paper transferring the deed to ensure a seamless probate transition gave her absolute permanent dominion over my life. She was dead wrong. Vanessa pulled up the master files of the living trust, and what we uncovered completely validated my tactical position. While Madison mistakenly believed Tyler's position as a future successor beneficiary gave them immediate ownership leverage, the underlying operational scaffolding of the entire property remained exclusively bound to my personal social security number and my independent cash flow. The legal contracts that allowed that house to exist as a functional shelter were entirely mine. I sat across from Vanessa, feeling a cold, refreshing wave of administrative power wash over me. My emotional investment in their lives had yielded nothing but negative returns, and it was time to completely liquidate the account. I gave Vanessa a single core directive: downgrade the master homeowner's insurance to a bare-bones, structure-only landlord policy, effective at exactly midnight on the final day of the month. For 30 long years, I had faithfully paid those premiums to shield this structure from total disaster. Now, they could carry that uninsured risk completely on their own. Next, I logged into the Cook County Municipal Portal and permanently revoked the auto-debit link for the steep semi-annual property taxes. I updated the primary administrative contact info, ensuring that the impending default warnings and government fiscal notices would be delivered straight to Tyler's corporate email box. He would finally see the true, unvarnished cost of the real estate he claimed to own. My final operational strike was directed straight at our regional energy provider. I officially terminated the automated premium winter fuel delivery contract that kept our master furnace alive. It was late September in Illinois. The Midwestern autumn wind was already turning incredibly sharp, rattling the windows of the lower floor. The massive heating oil tank buried deep beneath Robert's concrete foundation was currently sitting at less than 5% capacity. It was running on absolute fumes. When I returned to the house, I didn't perform a single uncompensated domestic act. I informed Madison, with a polite, even smile, that since our relationship was now defined strictly by a transactional landlord-tenant lease, I was legally absolved from any family expectations or unpaid labor. I spent the evening packing my essential titles, medical records, and investment statements into a small, fireproof lockbox. I wasn't an evicted victim fleeing in the night. I was a senior operations officer executing a controlled, strategic disinvestment. I tucked the lockbox firmly under my arm, leaving the entitled couple to navigate a brutal, impending Midwestern winter on their own heavily leveraged, debt-ridden incomes. The domestic Cold War officially shifted into a criminal execution on a Tuesday morning. Desperate to paralyze my financial movement and force me into an absolute submission, Madison had executed her final, most toxic maneuver. She had spent days whispering poison into Tyler's ear, manipulating my spineless son until he finally signed his name alongside hers on a formal emergency conservatorship petition. They filed it directly with the county court, falsely claiming that I was exhibiting severe signs of cognitive decline and diminished capacity simply because I refused to comply with their household financial restructuring. It was a calculated, vicious strategy. Madison's actual objective was to lock up my independent retirement accounts, hidden deep within the living trust, using the threat of a legal guardianship to blackmail me into signing a lifetime financial care guarantee for her mother, Stephanie. When Vanessa called me back into her office, the air inside the room was completely still. My attorney didn't look worried. She looked absolutely lethal. During her aggressive, forensic review of the cross-filed trust documents and our historic banking attachments, Vanessa hadn't just uncovered a defensive loophole, she had uncovered a major felony. 3 months prior, a secondary loan authorization had been quietly processed through a private equity lender to secure a $40,000 line of credit. That money had been immediately utilized to upgrade Madison's luxury vehicle, ensuring she looked the part of a successful brand manager among her elite peers. The signature on the binding authorization line read Patricia Vance, but the loops of the cursive were entirely wrong. Vanessa had already cross-referenced it with an independent handwriting expert. It was a clear, undeniable forgery. Madison had literally falsified my identity on a federal banking document just to prop up her expensive, hollow lifestyle. In her absolute greed, she had completely forgotten that a professional logistics coordinator tracks every single signature and every single point of data in the supply chain. The emergency conservatorship petition didn't just collapse, it became an absolute legal death sentence for their entire unearned existence. By attempting to portray me as incompetent, Madison had forced a forensic spotlight directly onto her own criminal financial records. Vanessa didn't waste a single line on familial politeness. She drafted a cold, factual legal ultimatum and routed it directly to their predatory attorney. The terms were completely non-negotiable. They were informed in clinical, unambiguous language that we possessed irrefutable evidence of felony, financial fraud, and forgery. Any further attempt to contest my operational decisions or freeze my assets would result in an immediate criminal referral to the state prosecutor for grand larceny. Every single card they held had evaporated in an instant. They were no longer just ungrateful adult children playing a high-stakes game of domestic control. They were legally exposed individuals standing on the trapdoor of a federal penitentiary. The structural cage Madison had so carefully designed to lock me away had snapped violently shut on her own wrist, and I hadn't even had to raise my voice. The brutal Illinois winter officially arrived in Oak Park overnight, transforming the grand Craftsman mansion into a freezing, echoing stone vault. The heating oil tank under the foundation had finally touched absolute zero. The automated, high-end smart HVAC system suffered a complete blackout, and without the high-speed wireless internet to bridge the communication gap, the entire property simply died. Frost began creeping up the interior window panes, thick, jagged, and unapologetic. Madison came charging down the hardwood stairs, her face completely drained of color, shivering violently inside her expensive designer robe. She slammed her cold palms onto the granite kitchen island, her teeth chattering with a mix of hypothermia and absolute panic. She shrieked that the water pipes were on the verge of freezing and bursting, demanding that I immediately sign a check for $1,200 to pay for an emergency technician and authorize an immediate $1,500 rush delivery from a priority fuel truck. Tyler's personal bank card had just been flatly declined at the commercial depot, and their luxury world was collapsing into ice. I sat perfectly still by the frosted window, wrapped tightly in my heavy wool coat, calmly taking the final sip of my Earl Grey tea. I didn't match her panic. I didn't raise my voice. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the clinical legal envelope Vanessa had prepared, and casually slid it across the cold kitchen island. This was the moment of absolute structural inversion. I looked directly into Madison's trembling eyes and dissected the fragile architecture of her reality. I explained that her arrogant, upper-class position was nothing more than an optical illusion, a high-status facade she had merely rented from my silent generosity and my hidden cash flow. This wasn't a family dynamic anymore. It was an accounting layout that had finally been balanced. I forced her to confront the brutal difference between merely having your name printed on a legal piece of deed paper and actually possessing the internal structural capacity to maintain a historic legacy. Her unearned authority was a luxury subscription she could no longer afford to maintain. I calmly announced that I had officially deducted my $1,600 October rent from the massive municipal utility overpayments I had quietly settled out of my own account earlier that month. On the books, we were completely, undeniably square. I stood up, buttoned my coat, and picked up my fireproof lockbox. I left my spineless son, Tyler, standing completely paralyzed in the drafty doorway, while Madison stood shivering in the center of her hollow, freezing kingdom. "You demanded clear transactional boundaries, Madison," I said, my voice factual and lethal. "Welcome to your property." Right on the dot at 7:30 a.m. on Monday morning, a small moving truck backed into the driveway under a grey, quiet sky. Because Tyler and Madison were sleeping off their absolute financial exhaustion upstairs, they didn't hear a single thing as the professional movers cleared my remaining belongings. In under 40 minutes, my bed, my mahogany desk, my grandmother's antique china, and Robert's original engineering blueprints were safely loaded up. I had prepped everything perfectly so there wouldn't be a sound. When the truck pulled away, I stood alone in the empty space, feeling the weight of decades lift right off my chest. I walked out to the foyer and left my house key on the console table. Right next to it, I left a second envelope containing the cancellation confirmations for the high-speed internet and the landline. I pulled the front door shut behind me, and the solid click of the lock sounded like absolute freedom. I got into my car and hit the road. As soon as I merged onto the highway, heading north toward Wisconsin, I felt years of heavy, suffocating expectations evaporate. Around noon, the crisp lake air hit my lungs as I pulled into my independent cedar bungalow on Lake Geneva, which I had seamlessly monitored and brought to a perfect temperature via the smart thermostat. I wasn't a tenant here. I wasn't a burden. I turned my phone on airplane mode, leaving behind an immediate digital avalanche of desperate messages from Tyler, revealing that their home internet was dead, the hot water was gone, the pipes were freezing, and Madison had already packed her bags to abandon him completely. 3 months later, a beautiful, snowy January day settled over the lake. My bungalow was toasty and warm, and the whole place smelled like the fresh apple pie I had just pulled out of the oven. The grand Craftsman house in Oak Park was swiftly put on the market by my legal team, once Tyler and Madison signed a formal surrender of occupancy to avoid immediate criminal prosecution. I liquidated the historic estate on my own terms, securing my late husband's equity safely into my private accounts. Meanwhile, the official fraud investigation triggered an immediate repossession of Madison's luxury vehicle to offset her $40,000 forged liability, leaving them completely bankrupt. Deprived of my bank account acting as a financial buffer, their superficial marriage completely shattered under the raw weight of reality, ending in a bitter, unceremonious divorce. Tyler came up to visit me last week. He looked thinner and humbler, but for the first time in his adult life, he carried himself like a real adult. He handed me a beautiful bouquet of flowers, paid for entirely with his own hard-earned money. We didn't rehash the painful details of the past, but as I mended my winter garden, I looked at him and smiled. I've come to realize that true strength is not measured by how much disrespect you can tolerate, but by your courage to walk away when your love is treated as a transactional commodity. If you do not construct your own boundaries, others will gladly build a restrictive cage for you out of your own kindness. Freedom begins the exact second you stop financing the arrogance of people who refuse to grow up. Let them experience the cold winter of their own choices. It is the only architecture through which they will ever learn the weight of real accountability. Forgiveness isn't always for the benefit of the other person. Sometimes it's the only path to set yourself free, reclaim your narrative, and step fully into your own peace. Drop a comment with where you are listening from and what time it is right now. Let's see who is standing strong in our resilient community tonight. If Patricia's journey taught you to protect your own worth, hit that share button, leave your thoughts on boundary protection in the comments below, and subscribe to secure your own peace. Let's start a real conversation in our community today.